I always like to say that a professional like a lawyer neither chooses his clients nor indeed judges them. A lawyer doesn't choose his client nor does he judge them. If he started judging them, he would really have to at least largely leave his blow to the lawyer. That has to be left to a judge. Now, all of us are humans. We do understand. We have our likes and dislikes. We have our, perceptions, our beliefs, even our conviction. But to convict a client or to acquit a client in your mind and then do the case is not the right approach for a lawyer. I always like to give the example of Indira Gandhi's assassin. I was abroad in those years, and I don't think there was a single human being on planet Earth on 31st of October 1984 who did not think, not a single human being, who did not think that those three Sikh gentlemen had not killed Mrs. Gandhi and were guilty. You know, it's very interesting. They went through a trial. All three were convicted and all three were given death penalty at the trial court level. At the high court level, one was converted to life imprisonment and two were sustained. Namely, two were convicted to death. They appealed again to the Supreme Court, and obviously all this is happening through lawyers. The Supreme Court, which is the end result today, acquitted one altogether. He walked free. Convicted one and maintained death sentence. And convicted the third and converted to life imprisonment. Now, the point that I'm making is, without legal representation of an independent, fearless, non-biased kind, without your own subjective predilections allowing to color your thinking, these people would not have had a fair trial from the lawyers they had. So, ultimately, to end my answer to your question a little longer than I expected it to be, you know, a lawyer has a very difficult task. He has multiple duties simultaneously operating. He has the duty first and foremost to his client, to be straightforward, fearless, strong, not to give up anything he is representing. But simultaneously, and the job is not to prove him guilty or innocent. It is to put his case in the best perspective. You'll be astonished how many shades of gray there are in real life. There is no black and there is no white. There are shades of gray. It's your job as a lawyer to bring out those shades of gray in the best possible light from your client's perspective. But simultaneously, he has to perform a second duty, not the duty to his client, but to the court, of being fair. Simultaneously, he has to perform his duty to society. So this is a very difficult tightrope walk, but then it worked. For me, law has been my first love. It is the thing in which I have spent the longest period of my life. And unless I enjoyed it, I don't think I would have survived this long. Probably unemployed. I decided to be a lawyer way back in my early college days. And I don't think today I'm good for any vocation other than that. So I think it's a hypothetical question, which fortunately now at my age, I don't have to answer. If I was forced to contemplate that, I'd like to be a teacher. I was actually a teacher for a while. If I had not come back, I had started teaching in a small way in Cambridge, where I was doing my PhD. And I left there and came back to law practice. So possibly, if I was not compelled to come back and be in India, I would have continued teaching. And I enjoy writing and teaching even now when I get the time. Justice has to be fair. Justice has to be, by the way, a lot of it has to be according to law. It is not your sense of justice and my sense of justice. It is in accordance with law. But yes, you have some discretion after you applied the law to stretch it this way or that way to do justice as you think. Faith is something which is belief, trust. It has nothing to do always with rationality or logic. It has nothing to do with rules and regulations. So I think it's a wrong mixture. And when you're doing justice, don't bring in faith. And when you're in matters of faith, it depends on what your sense of justice is. Well, I think it's been a very enjoyable journey, if you ask me, as a lawyer in the early years, and of course as a multitasker subsequently. I have had the maximum enjoyment period in this profession. I have enjoyed its vicissitudes, its challenges. I think law is a very unusual profession in that, I mean, all professions are interesting and honorable, a doctor's profession, an architect, an engineer. But there is nothing which intersects or touches on life and people in life, their daily problems, as much as law does. A doctor ultimately does touch upon life, but in the close confines of a consultation or an operating table. In the normal lives of a human being, an architect and an engineer and a doctor cannot affect and intersect as much as a lawyer does, which is why it's a great profession, which is why it's a springboard for so many other activities. You find more people from this profession than any other. And it also, in a sense, is connected because it is the art of persuading a judge. It's pretty much the art of persuading people in life. So persuasion, putting an issue with the best perspective, shedding the best light, giving a healing touch, solving human problems and society's problems. These make it a very unique profession. In the future, I think our profession is based very much on orality. It's going to become less and less oral. It's going to become more and more written. Corona is a very good example. It has taught us to be more precise, disciplined, virtual. I believe that the new normal of law should continue even after Corona to have 25 to 50% hearings virtually. Well, it's a whole different world out there. Written briefs, precise, less interruption, less long-winded arguments, less orality, etc., etc. But that's after my generation. I don't think there is ever a one case which makes you what you are. I think law, and this is a wrong approach for people, youngsters, to think that that's a magic button. You press it and that one case makes you the halo. Law, as other professions, are incremental. A doctor does a good operation on you, and he doesn't advertise it that I operated on Prachi and did this and that. It is by word of mouth that Prachi commends it to other people, and by word of mouth the third person commends it to a fourth person. All professions are like that. Secondly, if you ask me personally, there is a whole huge number of cases. At last count, somebody said I've done some thousands of cases. So it's difficult to choose. But to answer your question, the very challenging ones, the very high learning curves, the very fascinating ones, the exciting ones have been in hundreds also. So I'm giving you kind of a 5-item list, which is imperfect and incomplete, but certainly in corporate commercial matter, BALCO and arbitration would stand out. In 356, President's Rules, Speaker's Powers, Public Law, Uttarakhand and Karnataka would stand out. In developing the point of some of these cases I discussed in this book, you could choose only 10, but obviously this book has many of these, which is why they are selected for the book. Yellow Pages, the development of commercial and corporate law together in a unique manner. Sabarimala, a very fascinating case on right to faith and the various, various perceptions of that concept, etc., etc. And in my very young days, when I was appointed MICUS in custodial torture and custodial death in BK Batu, very young, I just started off in those days. Sabarimala has many facets, but I'll answer your narrow issue. I think it's not only on A or B, but I've always believed, people say there is a lot of threat to free speech. Of course, there is all over. But the threat to free speech is much less external, much more internal. And I believe the biggest threat to free thinking, not free, is the compulsion to conform. So let me explain. I mean, legally, logically, constitutionally, you may think X is right. But the compulsion to conform to an ethic and a rule set for you by an external agency, the media, tells you to say what is proper, not what is right. A lot of us say what is proper and not what is right, or maybe what is correct or what is legal, because we are compelled to conform. So if I say X, I'm anti dogs. If I say Y, I am pro-women. If I say Z, I am anti-Dalit. These are standards set for us by external compulsion to conform to standards set by some media. I'm not saying this case is that case. So obviously, judges or lawyers hearing or arguing Sabrimala have to be clear that they are fearless enough to state the constitutional position as they see it, without being scared by the compulsion to conform. Oh, you are anti-women. Because you want to exclude women without understanding. This is obviously a very oversimplistic reaction, which I will explain when I come to Sabrimala. So, but the pressure is a lot when you come out of Sabrimala and you are facing the media. Oh, are you anti-women? Are you people who want to depress and crush women because you want to exclude them? So you have to say, look, this is the legal aspect. This is the nuance. Nothing to do with women actually. To do with the concept. Yeah. And then you have to withstand the compulsion to conform. And my last sentence in this compulsion to conform is a lot of pressure in the back of your mind, even as a judge. A judge cannot allow himself to think, if I write this judgment, what will the media think? What kind of a person am I? If I write that judgment, what will civil society think? What kind of a judge am I?
Yeah.
He has to do what his conscience tells him is right as per the legal book and as per the constitution.
Yeah.
But it's easy to say that. The compulsion to conform is real. You ask yourself in daily life, a lot of things you do is what you say is proper, not what is correct. Because you have to be compelled to conform. I think you've answered your question partly. It's absolutely wrong. Because apart from anything else, it's not a case of A versus B. It's a case of shaking your faith in the system. We lawyers, I like to call it leapfrogging. Now, leapfrogging is important sometimes. Important case of a man about to die, something about to be demolished tomorrow, something where you have to put the death penalty day after. Obviously, they have to be leapfrog. It's common sense. But to leapfrog in normal other cases is a complete fundamental erosion of your faith in my system, of the average litigant and lawyer's faith in my system. The judicial system functions on a concept also of hierarchy. There's a ladder. So there are two kinds of leapfrogging. One is temporal, one is spatial. Temporal is when you leapfrog in time. The lady here whom I know, Miss Moti, files a case today and gets a listing tomorrow. The lady who's the anchor files a case 1 year ago and doesn't get a listing for 3 years. So that's a leapfrogging in time. Leapfrogging in space is when you leapfrog from the trial court right to the Supreme Court. You don't go to the trial court at all. Now it's obvious that there are rules already. There are urgency rules, there are listing rules, there are filing rules. It cannot be that just because you are a sensationalist, an important person, a prominent person, somebody in the face everywhere in the media, somebody who's a prominent or a rich person, it can't be a ground for leapfrogging. And I think this is a matter that the judges have to be very strict and straightforward. They have to enforce it, because in doing that enforcement, they are sending a message much beyond the A versus B paradigm of the case. That message is important for faith in the judiciary. And they have enough exception and enough power to make the exception where a genuine case demands leapfrogging. Yes, by all means do it. You see, a judiciary is ultimately, of course, it is, as they say, the biggest enforcer, the biggest director, the biggest adjudicator, the biggest decider, no doubt. But it's also an exemplar. A judiciary is an exemplar. A judiciary is a role model. And the straightforward answer to your question is that when there are such issues where a communal angle is clear, obviously, there can't be a general answer depending on the facts of the case. But there, they have to not only decide, but come down with a very clear and a heavy hand. Don't fudge. Don't be equivocal. Don't equivocate. If you find that ABC has done it, then you know there are enough laws to punish him under. Then don't do technical, avoidance techniques. That yes, he's guilty, but he's not guilty. We will not punish him enough. Because that punishment, straightforward and clear, sends its own message. What are you trying to deal with? Communalism. It's one of the three basic C's of India. Casteism, corruption, communalism are three scourges. So it's a whole pillar, just like your pillar of democracy. This is another pillar, a negative pillar of democracy. So this negative pillar, you have to deal with it straightforward hand. I mean, I always say, take example of 153A, which is our provision in the IPC. It's a provision against communal disharmony being created. Now, some people, some judges may tend to think that it's something, oh, it's okay, it's a violation in the heat of the moment. No, you have to, if you find it's violated, you have to apply it very strictly and strongly. And you will find that when judges at all levels, I don't mean Supreme Court, I don't mean High Court, I don't mean Trial Court, at all levels consistently apply it, you will find a diminution in over-adventurism on communal overturn. Well, I've written a lot of things here and there over the years, a fairly large corpus now. Two things I enjoyed doing for over 10 years was when I started writing columns. And I started with India.com, then wrote in Pioneer. But the bulk of the writing I did for Hindustan Times and Bank. So those columns were fortnightly. Almost for, many years I wrote fortnightly with some gap when I changed the platform. Those two have come out as two books, which are very interesting for the diversity of their topics. They deal with governance, they deal with sports, they deal with politics, they deal with law, they deal with tidbits of fun and humor, So they were published as two books, which is a good collection. It's very different from this one. This is a book which is dealing with law and law in a different way, put in a different way for a different segment of readers. So, then there's a third category, one of them is coming out now. I'm very happy and proud it's coming out. My PhD thesis of 1985. That's the third category, a hardcore academic work. 1 lakh words and 1 lakh words in footnotes, so 2 lakh words. Yeah. Everything heavily footnoted like a very hardcore. I mean, this is meant for the, the researcher and the lawyer. It's a textbook. So that's the third category. Yeah. These are all different. So you ask me how they are different. They're totally different things. All three of them. I did not conceive it. As they say, sometimes books are a joy to conceive, a pain to deliver. But in this case, there was no joy to conceive as far as I'm concerned, because the publisher thought of it. And I think she thought of a very good idea, because she said that A, it should be controversial, exciting, interesting cases, but B, also cases which are of interest to the lay reader. Yeah. This is not for a legal audience only. Yeah. And C, with the help of Mr. Satyajit Sarna, with whom I interacted closely, written in a very simple style, not turgid technical. So these intersected. Yeah. And of course, originally, when they came to photography for the cover page, the book's title given by the publisher was Case File. I thought Case File resembled the title of another book which had come out some years ago. So I said, this doesn't sound right. And then we looked around and we saw a phrase somewhere used by Satyajit Sarna. Because, when a litigator like me gets into a flow, there's nobody except you. You are reading of the brief last night and the judges in front of you. So bang there in the middle of the trenches, like World War II. And if your carbine doesn't work, it's only you and your gun and your fight which you're there with. So he had used the phrase somewhere in the book, in the trenches. And that's how we changed Case Files. That was my idea, that we kind of change it. And then, of course, they discussed. The phrase was Satyajit's in some part of the book. Uttarakhand was a fascinating case. I remember the High Court there is in Nainital, because the capital is Dehradun. I went there for literally 1 day, and it became 2 days. And over time, it became a month with, of course, a couple of gaps. There's only one hotel, and the entire hotel was occupied. It had many fascinating aspects, because opposing me were then Attorney General and 6 other counsels. So Mr. Mukul Rohgi, Mr. Tushar Mehta, Mr. Harinder Singh, Mr. Nalin Kohli, Mr. Salve, and Mr. Sundar for the private supporting MLAs, supporting the other side. It went on for almost a month, and the principal point on which we succeeded was a straightforward 356 point, namely that when I, as the Chief Minister, I meaning not the lawyer, but representing the Chief Minister of Uttarakhand, had succeeded in thwarting a no confidence against you, or showing prima facie the numbers, and then the Speaker adjourning for the short period of 8 days that the assembly will meet again because of the chaos it can't function. And again, he will show his numbers. And the numbers being shown tomorrow on a Monday morning. On the Saturday, on a recommendation of the governor, the central government imposed precedent. So we were able to show that it was clearly a malafide, abusive exercise of power to snatch. Because had Rawat been able to hold the meeting on Monday morning to show his confidence, but of course, if he had not shown his confidence, I said we should lose on the floor. But what they thought would be a defeat on the floor of the assembly, they imposed precedence rule on Saturday. Now, Bommai's judgment, Rameshwar's judgment, and a whole catena of judgments of three have sufficient interplay to show that this is a excessive, wrongful exercise of power. And that was the basis on which a judge who heard it in the Supreme Court, I must say, remarkable qualities of head and heart, great patience, and he went into the juristic principles day after day after day, despite a lot of dilatory tactics, even obstructive tactics, and delivered judgment within time, because time was of the essence, and struck down. The matter went to the Supreme Court. Technically, it is still pending. The matter went to the Supreme Court. The Chief Justice of India at that time, Justice Mishra, did not interfere, kept it pending. So the matter became infectious because subsequently the elections took place. But he did not interfere by restoring precedent. Sabrimala is obviously, it can sustain a whole semester. So I can't answer the question briefly. It's a very complicated legal issue, and one semester of a law school course can do only with Sabrimala. It deals with an intersection of articles 25 to 27 or 26, is the right to religion, practice, propagate, profess, etc. It intersects with the right of equality, women unequal. It intersects several other constitutional articles. Point one. Point two. What is the essence of, I'm speaking professional, it doesn't matter what I think or you think, we're talking now as a professional. What is the stand, and why my stand, I believe, is legally correct, constitutionally correct. It is, first of all, wrong to draw the equation between women versus non-women. There is no equation in Sabrimala of women versus non-women. It is about both men and women on one side, and another category of men and women on the other side. The excluded category of men and women are the men, those who don't do vratam, severe penance for 40 plus days of a celibate kind, but lots of other penance. Along with that excluded category is women who are of a menstruating age between 10 and 50. That's point one. So in purely legal terms, the Article 14 equation is not women versus men. It is men and women versus men and women of two categories. So there's no intention to per se exclude women. Number three, why is this exclusion of men of this category and women of this category valid in law? You see, there are 1,500 temples of Lord Kartikeya in the form in which Kartikeya is worshipped all across. 1,100 maybe. There's only one, maybe 1,500, 11, I don't remember, I think it's 1,500. Only one which celebrates him in the form of a Naishtika Brahmacharya. And a Naishtika Brahmacharya is an eternal celibate. There's a whole story I don't have time to go into, by which he was born and kind of installed there in that form, an eternal Brahmacharya. Now the point in law is that if you celebrate, you have to first show that you are a group, a sect. Obviously, otherwise you don't have a religious right. Secondly, you have to show that this is part of Hinduism, which is a religion, obviously. Thirdly, you have to show that this is a genuine faith and belief which lacks belief. It's not an individual faith and belief. All that is satisfied. Question is that a reasonable belief which can be protected by law? Well, the belief is that overwhelmingly the sect, which is a Sabrimala sect, and sects are protected under the Constitution, believe that something antithetical to the very essence of the deity, which is an eternal Naishtika Brahmacharya, cannot have an interaction or intersection with the deity. It is like saying that a temple devoted to the fire goddess is visited constantly by water, or a temple devoted to X is allowed access with that which is antithetical to X, namely Y. So that being the concept, the idea is that you will preserve the pristine glory of the original essence of that deity. And that makes it a reasonable nexus that the exclusion is not arbitrary. The exclusion is what? The exclusion is those who have done severe penance, purified themselves, and are in a celibate status. Even men. For men, it is 40 days. Ratham, it is called penance. For women, it's of course an ad hoc decision, no doubt. But it is believed that the fertile phase from 10, 11 to 50 odd, it's ad hoc, it could be 55, it could be. But the concept is, are antithetical to the view which Sabarimala deity takes. Now the question is, this makes it a nexus between that of the deity and that which is excluded. It is not without nexus, it's not arbitrary. The court has to judge. But let me just end by saying, is it not common in every day? I mean, your mothers, sisters, friends, wives, without any restriction, as far as I know, for hundreds of years, on their own, decide not to go to temples during certain periods of menstruation. Some go, some may not, but people are hesitant. A lot of women don't enter a particular kind of Islamic mosque. Very Sunni women, not during menstruation, I think generally. So now these are practices which have an inherent nexus to the religion which is being celebrated. Now there is a concept, the question is not external standard of right and wrong. It is whether it's a genuinely held belief by a sufficiently large number of people who believe that this is religion. And nobody denies that the Sabarimala sect is one of the largest sects which follows that particular, religion. So how do you have a right to religion if you not protect something which you conceive is a religious sect? Unless, of course, I'll give the flip side example. Anand Margis claim that A, we are a religion, B, our religion requires us to dance a Tandav dance every once a year, and C, that in the Tandav dance we have to carry skulls and trishul. So the Commissioner of Bengal Police said that we can't do the Tandav dance on the street. So they challenged it. He said it creates a law and order situation. I'll not allow it. They challenged it. The first argument the court held was that you have to show that you are a religious sect. The Anand Margis are not a Hindu sect. Otherwise, everybody can call yourself a Hindu sect. It's not a recognized sect. Second, they said, assuming without considering that you are a Hindu sect, which we have shown you are not, you have not shown whether this practice of dancing with a trishul and a skull cap is an essential part of the religion. So tomorrow, if you say that my religion says I must walk naked, it doesn't mean nobody can stop you when you start walking naked. You have to show it to be an essential, intrinsic part of the religion which you are professing to practice. And then that activity has to have a nexus directly with that. So that's the way Sabarimala cases come. You see how interesting law can get. That's how the constitutional perspective comes. That's a difficult one, actually. That's another thing which took us a lot of time. When the publisher suggested this book, I spent many sittings with Satyajit deciding what to include. It was the Nobel Prize for Miniaturization to include 10 cases or 8 cases out of hundreds. And it was an arbitrary selection necessarily. As I said, the criteria was exciting, controversial, of interest to the common person, both the lawyer and the non-lawyer. Having done that, if I had a second book or a longer book or multi-volume, the ones I would like to also include are, of course, very large. Again, as I said, Balco arbitration not missed out. The Badal corruption case under the Prevention of Corruption Act. I'm using different subject headings because there are many cases under the same subject, but these are different subjects. Two recent cases of great interest are when I got struck down the RBI circular for directing automatically banks to take action in the IBC. Very interesting issues of corporate law. And then several IBC cases themselves, like Pioneer Homebuyer. These 3 or 4 would be very interesting exclusions. There are obviously constraints of space. But along with that, if I sit down and start selecting, there are hundreds more quite frankly. I've always said that multitasking is the joy of my life. It is also the bane of my life. It is not a very good thing for health. It's not recommended for good health. I just recently recorded some talk that people insisted on about the art of time management. Time management is a self-preservatory ethic with me. It is not something which is a luxury. I just have to do it to manage. But I think it's an attitude of mind. Unless you enjoy what you do, you can't do all of it. So, if I'm cribbing and cussing, everybody cribs and cusses because there's a large part of what we do which is worth cussing about. But in the basics, you have to enjoy it. Number two, I have now an attitude for many years that I start off with a list of 5 things to do, knowing that I can't do 2 of those 5. Try your best to do all 5. Give it your best shot. And then I'm very happy and relaxed if I don't do 2 of them. So, the regret used to be a very big problem earlier. Of course, in the morning, you would have a great competition between newspapers, walk, and reading the leftover files. And now there's a 4th addition to the competition, my grandson. So only 2 of those 4 get done in the morning time. And then from 10 to 1, it's a mad rush in court. We will be doing 5, 6, 7 cases. And it was very common till about 2012, 13 that one would finish whatever one put by 12, 13, and then rush from there to Parliament, change in the car, and reply to or open a debate in Parliament just as you enter. And then finishing that, maybe we come back in the afternoon, 2:33, and do a couple of cases here and there in High Court or in tribunal. And then at 4 o'clock, do a press conference. So this is a fascinating learning curve, and sometimes, you could do a 5th thing, which is rare, very rare, but to go and address a rally there at the beach there by 7 o'clock. So this is a fascinating learning curve. It's not good for the health. I don't recommend it. I don't do so much of it now, but it is also enjoyable. And, it's a luxury which few people have of choice. So I think I should be blessed and fortunate that I have the luxury and I have a certain amount of discretion in using that which I can't do. But that's the way life is structured. That's the way it is.